The stars belonged to the Kethmoran and had done so for 3,000 years. Their empire stretched across 50 star systems where hundreds of different species lived under their rule. The Kethmoran called themselves gods, and most beings in the galaxy believed them. They stood 12 feet tall with skin that looked like crystal and glowed with strange lights that moved under their surface like living things. When they spoke, their voices carried power that made other creatures want to bow down and obey without question. Their ships were unlike anything else in space. Made from the same crystal material as their bodies, these vessels could do things that seemed impossible. They could pass through solid rock and metal like ghosts, and their weapons could turn entire planets to dust with a single shot. The Kethmoran had never lost a battle and had never met a species that could stand against them for more than a few hours. Captain Jake Sullivan knew all of this as he sat in his command chair aboard the human vessel UHS Liberty. For the past 6 months he had been studying everything his crew could learn about the Kethmoran Empire. The 34-year-old captain had served in the human military for 15 years before taking command of the Liberty, and he knew a threat when he saw one. The intercepted messages his communications team had decoded painted a clear picture. The Kethmoran were coming for humanity next. The Liberty was the most advanced ship in the human fleet, but compared to Kethmoran technology, it might as well have been made from scrap metal. Jake's crew of 60 people were the best humanity had to offer, but they had never faced anything like what was heading their way. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Hayes sat at the tactical station going over the alien data for the 100th time. The 29-year-old officer had been trying to find some weakness in Kethmoran defenses, but their technology seemed flawless. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Danny Ross worked on modifications that might give them some small advantage. The brilliant 30-year-old had redesigned most of the Liberty systems since coming aboard, but he knew his improvements were nothing compared to what they would face. The Kethmoran ships drew power from sources that human science barely understood, and their weapons operated on principles that seemed to break the laws of physics. The Kethmoran had a simple way of dealing with new species they encountered. First, they would arrive in force with enough ships to destroy any resistance. Then they would demand immediate surrender and submission to their divine will. Species that surrendered quickly were allowed to keep their lives and serve the Empire as slaves. Those that resisted were eliminated completely with their worlds left as warnings to others. No species had ever successfully fought back against the Kethmoran. Zalthari had tried 200 years ago when the Empire first reached their system. They were an advanced race with powerful ships and energy shields that could deflect most weapons. The battle lasted 3 days before the Kethmoran grew tired of playing with them. When it ended, the Zalthari homeworld was gone and their entire species existed only in Kethmoran labor camps. The Veltar had been even more advanced, with ships that could travel faster than light without using jump gates. They had tried to run when the Kethmoran arrived, but discovered that their enemies could follow them anywhere. The chase lasted months as Veltar ships fled deeper and deeper into unexplored space. In the end, the Kethmoran hunted down every last vessel and added another species to their collection of servants. Admiral Zexthel commanded the Kethmoran fleet that was now approaching human space. He was old, even by Kethmoran standards, having lived for over 2,000 years and conquered more worlds than any other commander in the Empire. The lights under his crystal skin pulsed with patterns that showed his high rank and divine favor. In all his years of service, he had never encountered a species that could provide him with a real challenge. The Admiral found this disappointing, because he enjoyed the brief moments of excitement that came with conquest. Most races surrendered so quickly that there was no sport in defeating them. The few that tried to fight usually did so with such primitive weapons that destroying them felt more like pest control than warfare. Zexthel hoped that these humans might at least provide an hour or two of entertainment before accepting their fate. The human colonies at the edge of their space were completely unaware of what was coming toward them. The colonists on New Texas went about their daily lives farming the red soil and building new settlements. Their defense forces consisted of a handful of patrol ships with basic weapons and shields that could barely handle asteroid impacts. Against Kethmoran technology, they would last seconds, Captain? Sullivan studied the tactical displays showing Kethmoran fleet movements. 30 ships were heading directly for the new Texas system and would arrive within hours. Each vessel was larger than anything in the human fleet and carried enough firepower to level continents. The Liberty was the only human military ship in the area, and even if every colonial defense vessel joined them, they would still be outnumbered 10-1. Communications. Officer Pete Jordan received another intercepted transmission from the approaching fleet. The young officer had become expert at translating Kethmoran language over the past months of preparation. This message was different from the others because it was being broadcast on frequencies that human colonies would be able to receive. Admiral Zexfel was announcing the arrival of divine judgment and demanding immediate surrender from all human forces in the system. Lisa Hayes looked up from her tactical console with grim determination on her face. She had run every possible scenario through the ship's computers, and none of them showed humans surviving the coming battle. The Kethmoran ships were simply too advanced and too powerful for conventional weapons to damage. Their phase technology allowed them to become incorporeal at will, making them nearly impossible to hit, while their own weapons could punch through any known defensive system. Danny Ross emerged from the engine room covered in grease and carrying a datapad filled with his latest calculations. He had been working on theoretical ways to counter Kethmoran technology, but most of his ideas would require equipment and materials that the Liberty did not carry. Still, he had managed some improvements to their defensive systems that might buy them a few extra minutes of survival. The bridge crew watched their sensors as 30 points of light appeared at the edge of the new Texas system. The Kethmoran fleet had arrived and begun broadcasting their demands for surrender. Captain Sullivan looked at each of his officers, knowing that they were about to face an enemy that had never been defeated in 3,000 years of conquest. The gods had come to claim another world, and only one human ship stood in their way. Admiral Zexfel stood on the command deck of his flagship, watching the primitive human colony through the main viewing portal. The crystal ship hung in space like a massive jewel, catching starlight and reflecting it in rainbow patterns across its surface. Around him, 30 other Kethmoran vessels took positions that had been used in countless conquests before. The formation was more ceremonial than tactical because no enemy had ever required actual combat strategy. The admiral's skin pulsed with slow blue patterns that indicated his calm satisfaction. This would be another easy victory to add to his collection. The humans appeared to have basic space travel and some simple defensive installations, but nothing that would pose even the slightest challenge to divine technology. Their largest settlement held maybe 50,000 inhabitants, and their orbital stations were clearly designed for commerce rather than warfare. Captain Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of the Liberty, studying the alien fleet through his ship's sensors. Each Kethmoran vessel was at least twice the size of his ship, and their energy readings were off the charts. The strange crystalline hulls seemed to bend light around them, making it difficult to get accurate targeting data. Lisa Hayes worked frantically at her tactical station, trying to identify weak points in their formation, but the aliens seemed completely unconcerned about human capabilities. The first communication from the Kethmoran fleet arrived exactly as Jake had expected based on the intercepted messages his crew had decoded. Admiral Zexfel's voice carried across space with supernatural authority that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with power. The translation came through clearly thanks to Pete Jordan's work on their language systems over the past months. Primitive beings of this system, you now stand in the presence of divine authority. I am Admiral Zexfel, servant of the eternal Kethmoran Empire and herald of cosmic order. Your species will submit to divine will and accept your place as servants. In the great design, resistance will result in complete elimination of your kind from this galaxy. The message was broadcast on all human communication frequencies, ensuring that every person in the new Texas system would hear it. Jake could imagine the terror spreading through the colony as people realized they were facing something far beyond their understanding. The local defense forces would be scrambling to organize some kind of response, but their small patrol ships would be useless against Kethmoran technology. Jake activated the Liberty's main communication array and responded with words that would change everything. This is Captain Jake Sullivan of the United Human Systems vessel Liberty. You have entered sovereign human territory without permission. State your intentions and prepare to withdraw immediately. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. Admiral Zexthal had never received such a response from any species he had encountered. Usually there were immediate pleas for mercy or desperate attempts at negotiation. Sometimes there was complete silence as entire civilizations simply accepted their fate. But direct defiance was something entirely new in his experience. Danny Ross monitored the alien fleet from his position in the engine room. His sensors were picking up strange energy patterns from the Kethmoran ships that didn't match anything in human databases. The crystalline hulls seemed to phase in and out of normal space, creating readings that made no scientific sense. But within those impossible energy signatures, he was beginning to detect patterns that might represent vulnerabilities. The young engineer had spent years studying theoretical physics, and the Kethmoran technology appeared to operate on principles that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Their phase-shifting ability required enormous amounts of energy and created specific electromagnetic disturbances. If Danny could figure out how to exploit those disturbances, he might be able to give the Liberty some small advantage in the coming battle. Admiral Zexthal finally responded to Jake's challenge with amusement clear in his divine voice. You dare to make demands of God's little creature. Your ignorance is both entertaining and pathetic. I am Admiral Zexthal, and I have conquered more worlds than your species has years of existence. Submit now, and your deaths will be quick. Lisa Hayes had been analyzing the Kethmoran fleet positions while the communication exchange continued. The aliens maintained perfect formation with their flagship at the center, surrounded by smaller vessels in concentric circles. It was an impressive display of power, but it also revealed something important about their mindset. They were so confident in their superiority that they hadn't bothered to take defensive positions or prepare for actual combat. The tactical officer realized that the Kethmoran expected immediate surrender, just like every other species they had encountered. Their formation was designed for intimidation rather than battle, and their ships were positioned to deliver maximum psychological impact on the human colony. This arrogance might be the only advantage humanity would have in the coming fight. Captain Sullivan's next response sent shockwaves through the Kethmoran fleet. Admiral Zexthal, your empire's reputation means nothing in human space. This system is under our protection, and we will defend it against any threat. I suggest you reconsider your position before this escalates beyond your control. Pete Jordan watched his communication console as confused chatter erupted across Kethmoran fleet channels. The young officer had become skilled at monitoring alien transmissions and could see that Jake's words were causing genuine confusion among their enemies. The Kethmoran commanders were asking each other how to respond to a species that refused to acknowledge their divine authority. Admiral Zexthal felt something he had not experienced in centuries of conquest. For the first time since ascending to his current rank, he was dealing with a situation that didn't follow the established pattern. These humans were either incredibly brave or completely insane, and he wasn't sure which possibility was more disturbing. The Admiral decided to demonstrate divine power in hopes of bringing the humans to their senses. He ordered his weapons officers to target the largest human settlement and prepare to erase it from existence. The sight of 50,000 lives ending in an instant would surely convince any survivors to accept the inevitable. Danny Ross saw the energy buildup in the Kethmoran flagship before anyone else. His sensors detected massive power fluctuations as the alien vessel prepared to fire its main weapon. The engineering officer immediately activated ship-wide communications to warn Captain Sullivan that the aliens were about to demonstrate why they were considered gods by the rest of the galaxy. The crystalline flagship began to glow with internal light as reality-warping energy gathered in its primary weapon system. This was the same technology that had destroyed the Zalthari homeworld and countless other planets over the millennia. When fired, it would create a beam of pure destruction that could pierce any known defensive system and reduce matter to its component atoms. Jake watched the alien flagship prepare to fire and knew that he was about to witness the death of 50,000 innocent people. The Liberty was too far away to intercept the beam, and their shields would never survive contact with Kethmoran weapons. In seconds, the new Texas colony would become another example of divine wrath for future conquests. But Captain Sullivan had not spent months preparing for this moment, only to watch helplessly as his species faced extinction. He gave orders that would either save the colony or destroy his ship in the attempt. The Liberty began moving toward the Kethmoran flagship at maximum speed, while Danny Ross made final adjustments to their experimental defensive systems. Admiral Zexthel fired his divine weapon, confident that this demonstration would end human resistance once and for all. The beam of pure destruction raced toward the colony, carrying enough energy to shatter continents. But something impossible happened as the blast approached its target. The beam of divine destruction never reached the colony. Captain Jake Sullivan had positioned the Liberty directly between the Kethmoran flagship and its target. Just as Admiral Zexthel fired his reality-warping weapon, the entire human crew held their breath as the blast that could destroy planets struck their ship head-on. Instead of being vaporized, the Liberty absorbed the massive energy discharged through modified deflector arrays that Danny Ross had spent weeks reconfiguring. Admiral Zexthel stared at his tactical displays, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The human vessel should have been reduced to atoms by divine fire, yet it continued to exist as if nothing had occurred. The crystalline admiral's skin flashed with patterns of confusion and growing alarm as he tried to understand how primitive technology could withstand power that had destroyed countless worlds. Danny Ross watched his engineering displays with amazement as the Liberty's experimental systems handled energy levels that should have overloaded every circuit on the ship. His modifications to the deflector arrays had been based on theoretical calculations about Kethmoran technology, but he had never expected them to work so perfectly. The alien weapon discharged energy in specific frequencies that could be redirected. If you knew exactly how their phase technology operated, the young engineer had discovered that Kethmoran weapons created brief moments of vulnerability in their own defensive systems when fired. During those microsecond windows, their crystalline hulls became solid matter that could be damaged by conventional weapons. Danny had shared this information with Lisa Hayes, who had spent hours calculating precise firing solutions based on his data. Captain Sullivan activated his communication system and responded to the alien admiral's failed attack with calm confidence. Admiral Zexthel, your divine weapon appears to be malfunctioning. Perhaps you should consider surrendering before this situation becomes embarrassing for your empire. The words hit the Kethmoran commander like physical blows. In 3,000 years of conquest, no one had ever spoken to him with such casual dismissal of his power. The very concept that a primitive species could mock divine authority was so alien to his worldview that he struggled to process what was happening. Lisa Hayes had been waiting for this exact moment since the battle began. Her tactical computers had been tracking the energy patterns of every ship in the Kethmoran fleet, and she now had firing solutions for their most vulnerable targets. The moment Admiral Zexthel's flagship finished its weapon discharge, she gave Captain Sullivan the signal he had been waiting for. The Liberty opened fire with experimental plasma cannons that Danny Ross had modified based on their analysis of Kethmoran technology. The human weapons struck during the precise microsecond windows when the alien ships were vulnerable, and 3 crystalline vessels exploded in brilliant flashes of rainbow light. The Kethmoran fleet that had seemed invincible moments before suddenly found itself under attack by technology that could actually hurt them. Carl Murphy operated the Liberty's weapon systems with deadly precision. The 32-year-old weapons specialist had trained on every type of gun the human military possessed, but had never imagined he would be shooting at gods. His plasma cannons fired in carefully timed sequences that exploited the vulnerabilities Danny Ross had discovered in alien defensive systems. The destruction of 3 Kethmoran ships sent shockwaves through the remaining fleet. These vessels had been considered indestructible by every species in the galaxy, and their crews had never experienced the fear of death in battle. Now they watched their divine technology fail against human weapons that should have been utterly ineffective. Admiral Zexthal felt something completely foreign to his experience as he watched his ships die. Fear was an emotion that the Kethmoran had eliminated from their psychology centuries ago through genetic modification and mental conditioning. Yet, as he stared at the expanding clouds of debris that had once been divine vessels, he could not deny the cold sensation spreading through his crystalline body. The admiral ordered his remaining ships to return fire, but discovered that the human vessel had somehow anticipated his commands. The Liberty moved through space with impossible agility, avoiding Kethmoran weapons while continuing its devastating counterattack. Captain Sullivan's crew worked with perfect coordination as if they had been fighting gods their entire lives. Navigator Sophie Brown calculated jump coordinates that allowed the Liberty to appear where Kethmoran sensors indicated it was impossible for any ship to exist. The 27-year-old officer had studied alien movement patterns and discovered that their phase technology created blind spots in their own detection systems. By exploiting these gaps, she could position the Liberty for surprise attacks that the enemy never saw coming. Medical Officer Ben Clark kept the crew functioning at peak efficiency despite the intense stress of their impossible battle. The 31-year-old doctor had prepared emergency stimulants and stress management protocols that allowed human bodies to handle the extreme G-forces generated by their high-speed maneuvers. While the Kethmoran relied on their superior physiology, the humans used chemistry and determination to match their capabilities. Pete Jordan managed to jam the alien fleet's coordination signals while maintaining perfect communication between all sections of the Liberty. The communications officer had learned enough about Kethmoran technology to disrupt their command networks without affecting human systems. This forced the enemy ships to operate independently rather than as a coordinated divine force. Admiral Zexthal found his tactical options becoming increasingly limited as more of his fleet fell to human weapons. The Liberty seemed to predict every move his ships made and exploit weaknesses that should not have existed in perfect divine technology. The human vessel fought with a combination of scientific precision and reckless courage that the Kethmoran had never encountered. Danny Ross continued to modify the Liberty systems even as the battle raged around them. His engineering teams worked under extreme pressure to enhance their weapons and defenses based on real-time analysis of Kethmoran technology. The young engineer had turned his ship into something unprecedented in galactic history, a vessel that could match divine capabilities through pure human innovation. The psychological impact on the Kethmoran fleet was becoming as devastating as the physical damage. These beings had defined themselves as gods for 3 millennia based on their technological superiority and the immediate submission of every species they encountered. The concept that another race could not only resist but actively defeat them challenged the very foundation of their existence. Captain Sullivan watched his tactical displays as the alien formation began to break apart under the pressure of human attacks. The surviving Kethmoran ships were no longer maintaining their ceremonial positions and were instead trying desperate maneuvers to avoid destruction. For the first time in their species' history, they were fighting for survival rather than conquest. Lisa Hayes targeted the next group of enemy vessels with ruthless efficiency. Her tactical systems had learned to predict when each Kethmoran ship would enter its vulnerable phase, and her weapons fired with machine-like precision. The lieutenant commander felt no satisfaction in destroying enemies that had seemed impossible to defeat because she knew the battle was far from over. Admiral Zexthal realized that his divine fleet was being systematically destroyed by a single human warship. Half of his vessels were gone, and the rest were being hunted through space by an enemy that refused to acknowledge Kethmoran superiority. The admiral faced a choice that no member of his species had ever been forced to make in their entire history of conquest. The battle had raged for 18 hours, and Admiral Zexthal watched in growing horror as his divine fleet continued to fall before human weapons. The Liberty moved through space like a predator stalking its prey, picking off Kethmoran vessels one by one with deadly precision. What had begun as a simple conquest had become a nightmare that challenged everything the Admiral believed about his species and their place in the universe. Captain Jake Sullivan stood on his bridge coordinating the most impossible military victory in human history. His crew had been fighting without rest since the battle began, but their determination never wavered. Every person aboard the Liberty understood that they were not just defending a single colony, but proving that humanity would never bow to anyone who claimed divine authority over them. Danny Ross had pushed the ship's systems far beyond their design limits, but somehow everything continued to function. The young engineer had made modifications during the battle that turned the Liberty into something completely new, a vessel that combined human innovation with captured Kethmoran technology. His teams worked around the clock maintaining equipment that was performing miracles of physics and engineering. Lisa Hayes felt the weight of every tactical decision as she continued to target enemy vessels. The lieutenant commander had learned to read Kethmoran movement patterns like an open book, and could predict their maneuvers minutes before they executed them. Her weapons fired with mathematical precision, exploiting vulnerabilities that existed for mere microseconds in their divine defensive systems. The surviving Kethmoran ships tried increasingly desperate tactics to destroy the human vessel that was hunting them through space. They attempted coordinated attacks, ramming maneuvers, and even sacrificial runs where entire crews died trying to take the Liberty with them. Nothing worked because Captain Sullivan's crew had studied their enemies for months and knew how to counter every strategy the aliens possessed. Navigator Sophie Brown had memorized every gravitational anomaly and spatial distortion in the new Texas system. She used this knowledge to position the Liberty where Kethmoran sensors could not track them accurately. The 27-year-old officer guided her ship through impossible maneuvers that violated standard navigation protocols but somehow worked against enemies who thought they understood the laws of physics. Medical officer Ben Clark treated injuries and exhaustion with the skill of someone who had served in the worst military conflicts humanity had ever faced. The 31-year-old doctor kept his crew functioning through stimulants, emergency surgery, and sheer force of will. While Kethmoran physiology was superior human, medicine was proving more adaptable to the extreme conditions of prolonged combat. Pete Jordan maintained communication between all sections of the Liberty while simultaneously jamming enemy coordination efforts. The communications officer had become so skilled at disrupting Kethmoran technology that their remaining ships could barely talk to each other. This forced them to fight as individuals rather than as the coordinated divine force they had been for 3,000 years. Admiral Zexthel felt his sanity beginning to crack under the pressure of continued defeat. The crystalline patterns under his skin flickered with chaotic colors that indicated extreme psychological stress. In all his centuries of existence, he had never experienced failure on this scale, and his mind struggled to process the reality of divine fallibility. The Admiral's flagship had taken severe damage from repeated human attacks, his reality warping. Weapons were offline, and his phase shields flickered unpredictably as Danny Ross's countermeasures disrupted their operation. For the first time in Kethmoran history, their supreme technology was being systematically defeated by what they had considered a primitive species. Carl Murphy continued to operate the Liberty's weapons with the precision of a master craftsman. The weapons specialist had fired thousands of shots during the battle, and everyone had been perfectly timed to exploit Kethmoran vulnerabilities. His plasma cannons glowed white-hot from continuous use, but they never missed their targets or failed to penetrate enemy defenses. The psychological impact on the surviving Kethmoran crews was becoming more devastating than the physical destruction of their ships. These beings had been raised from birth to believe in their divine nature and technological superiority. Watching human weapons tear through their defenses was like watching the fundamental laws of reality collapse around them. Captain Sullivan could see the growing desperation in enemy movements as their formation completely broke apart. The Kethmoran ships were no longer trying to conquer the human colony, but were instead fighting for their own survival. Some vessels attempted to flee the system only to be hunted down by the Liberty before they could escape to hyperspace. Danny Ross had managed to capture and analyze wreckage from destroyed Kethmoran vessels during brief lulls in the fighting. His engineering teams reverse-engineered alien technology in real time, incorporating improvements into the Liberty systems while the battle continued around them. The ship was becoming more powerful with each passing hour as human ingenuity adapted divine technology for their own purposes. Lisa Hayes watched her tactical displays as the number of enemy contacts continued to decrease. Half of the original Kethmoran fleet was gone and the survivors were scattered across the system in full retreat. The lieutenant commander felt no satisfaction in their victory because she understood the terrible cost of challenging beings who had considered themselves gods for millennia. Admiral Zexthal received reports from his surviving ship commanders that painted a picture of complete strategic collapse. His divine fleet was being destroyed by a single human vessel using weapons that should not have been able to penetrate Kethmoran defenses. The mathematical impossibility of their situation was driving some of his officers to the edge of madness. The admiral tried to contact the Kethmoran High Command for reinforcements, but discovered that human jamming was preventing long-range communication. Pete Jordan had learned to disrupt their quantum communication networks, leaving the fleet isolated and unable to call for help. They would have to face their defeat alone without divine intervention from their homeworld, Sophie Brown calculated. Pursuit courses that allowed the Liberty to catch fleeing Kethmoran vessels before they could escape the system. Her navigation skills had become legendary among the crew as she guided their ship through maneuvers that defied conventional understanding of physics. The young officer was writing new textbooks on combat navigation with every impossible course. Correction. Ben Clark treated exhaustion and stress injuries while monitoring crew psychological conditions. The medical officer knew that fighting gods took a toll on human minds as well as bodies. He used counseling techniques and chemical aids to keep his functioning at peak efficiency. Despite the surreal nature of their enemy and the cosmic implications of their victory, Carl Murphy's weapons had destroyed more divine vessels than any human had thought possible. The weapons specialist operated his systems with mechanical precision even as his targets became increasingly desperate in their attempts to survive. Each shot fired represented another crack in the foundation of Kethmoran authority across the galaxy. Admiral Zexthal faced the unthinkable possibility that his mission would end in complete failure. No Kethmoran fleet had ever been defeated in 3,000 years of conquest, and the psychological impact of such a loss would devastate the Empire's ability to control their subject species. The Admiral realized that he was about to become the first divine commander in history to face the choice between surrender and total annihilation. Admiral Zexthal stared at the tactical display showing the wreckage of his once mighty fleet scattered across the New Texas system. Only 7 ships remained from the 30 vessels that had arrived with such confidence just hours before. The crystalline admiral's skin flickered with patterns of defeat and confusion as he faced a choice no Kethmoran commander had ever confronted in their species. History of Conquest. Captain Jake Sullivan opened communication channels to the surviving alien vessels and offered terms that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the battle. Admiral Zexthal, your fleet is defeated, and your ships are no match for human technology. I am prepared to allow your surrender and safe passage from this system if you agree to never return to human space. The words struck the Kethmoran commander like physical blows because they represented the complete reversal of everything he had expected from this encounter. He was supposed to be dictating terms to a conquered species, not begging for mercy from beings his empire considered barely above animals. The concept of divine forces asking for safe passage was so alien to his worldview that his mind struggled to process the reality. Danny Ross worked frantically to repair battle damage while analyzing wreckage from destroyed Kethmoran vessels. The young engineer had learned more about alien technology in the past day than human science had discovered in decades of research. His teams were incorporating captured systems into the Liberty's defenses, creating hybrid technology that combined the best of both civilizations. The engineering officer realized that human victory had been possible only because they approached the problem differently than any species the Kethmoran had encountered before. Instead of trying to match alien technology directly, they had found ways to exploit its weaknesses and turn its own power against itself. This represented a fundamental shift in galactic warfare that would change everything, Lisa Hayes monitored the remaining enemy ships while preparing for the possibility that they might choose death over surrender. The tactical officer had studied Kethmoran psychology during their months of preparation and understood that accepting defeat would be almost impossible for beings who had defined themselves as gods. Some of the surviving vessels were already showing signs of preparing for suicide attacks. Admiral Zexthal felt the weight of 3,000 years of Kethmoran superiority crashing down around him as he considered Captain Sullivan's offer. Accepting surrender would mean acknowledging that his species was not divine, and that their empire was built on an illusion of invincibility. But refusing would mean the destruction of his remaining ships and crews. For no purpose other than maintaining a lie, Pete Jordan had been monitoring communication channels throughout the Kethmoran Empire and was detecting the first signs of chaos spreading across their territory. News of the fleet's defeat was somehow reaching other star systems despite attempts to maintain communication blackouts. The young officer realized that this single battle would have consequences that stretched far beyond the new Texas system, the communications. Officer began receiving messages from enslaved species across the galaxy asking if the reports of Kethmoran defeat were real. Civilizations that had lived under divine rule for centuries were beginning to question the authority of their masters for the first time. The psychological impact of human victory was already fracturing an empire that had seemed eternal. Captain Sullivan made the decision that would define humanity's role in galactic politics for generations to come. Instead of pursuing the fleeing Kethmoran vessels, he allowed them to escape while broadcasting messages of support to any species seeking freedom from the Empire. The Liberty had proven that the gods could bleed, and now it was time for others to learn that lesson. Sophie Brown calculated escape routes for the surviving alien ships, while maintaining pursuit courses that would prevent any last-minute attacks on the human colony. The navigator had become expert at predicting Kethmoran movement patterns during the battle, and could ensure they left the system without causing further damage. Her skills would be needed for the challenges that lay ahead. Ben Clark treated the exhausted crew while documenting the medical effects of prolonged combat against technologically superior enemies. The doctor's research would become the foundation for new training protocols as humanity prepared for its expanded role in galactic affairs. Fighting gods required different physical and psychological preparation than conventional warfare. Carl Murphy secured his weapons while analyzing the effectiveness of human technology against Kethmoran defenses. The weapons specialist had proven that divine armor could be penetrated and divine ships could be destroyed. His tactical data would be studied by military strategists across human space as they planned for future conflicts with remaining Imperial forces. Admiral Zexthal finally accepted the inevitable and broadcast his surrender to the Liberty. The words came out as broken fragments because the Kethmoran language had no proper terms for divine defeat. His remaining ships powered down their weapons and began the humiliating retreat from a system they had come to conquer with absolute confidence in their success. Danny Ross watched the alien fleet disappear into hyperspace while beginning work on his most ambitious project yet. The young engineer planned to use captured Kethmoran technology to upgrade human ships throughout the fleet. Within months, every vessel in human space would carry weapons, capable of challenging divine authority wherever it was found. The news of Kethmoran defeat spread across the galaxy through quantum communication networks that no empire could completely control. Species that had been enslaved for centuries began organizing resistance movements while others declared independence from divine rule. The Veltar emerged from hiding to reclaim their homeworld, and the surviving Zalthari rose up against their labor camps. Captain Sullivan received communications from dozens of alien civilizations requesting human assistance in their fights for freedom. The Liberty had become a symbol of hope for oppressed species everywhere, and proof that no being or empire had the right to claim divine authority over others. Humanity found itself thrust into a leadership role they had never sought but could not abandon. Lisa Hayes began planning defensive strategies for human space as the crew realized their victory would make them targets for Cathmoran revenge. The tactical officer understood that this battle was only the beginning of a much larger conflict that would determine the future of galactic civilization. The gods had been wounded, but they were not yet dead. Within months, the Cathmoran Empire began to fracture as rebellions erupted across their territory. Some aliens adapted to the new reality by abandoning their claims of divinity and seeking diplomatic relations with their former subjects. Others retreated to their homeworld, unable to accept that they were simply another advanced species rather than cosmic deities. Admiral Zexthal never commanded another fleet after his defeat at New Texas. The broken admiral spent his remaining years in exile, trying to understand how divine technology had failed against human innovation. His reports became required reading at military academies as strategists studied the fall of an empire that had seemed invincible for 3,000 years. The Liberty continued to patrol human space while carrying the message that gods don't bleed, don't retreat, and don't make mistakes. The Cathmoran had done all three, proving they were never gods at all, but simply another species that had confused superior technology with divine right. Captain Sullivan and his crew had shattered an illusion that had oppressed hundreds of worlds for millennia, and the galaxy would never be the same.